Hello everyone, my name is Lydia and welcome to Food Motto. This is where we talk about food. So in today's video we're going to talk about ugali and we are going to dissect some of the information that is out there, especially in the mainstream media. We are going to talk about some of the research that has been done. We are going to finally discuss and address the debate between wholemeal flour and all wholemeal ugali and ugali that is made from refined corn flour. We are going to talk about the issue of aflatoxins and the politics around fortification of refined corn flour, and we are going to actually discuss if the fortification is being done in a correct way. So first of all, and I should have actually started the video like this, I'd like to thank you for clicking on this video, and I hope that you are going to watch it up to the very end and you are going to gain something from this video. So without further ado, let's start by defining what ugali is. And I'm sure most of you know, but for formality purposes, we are going to have a quick definition of ugali, which is that it's a stiff porridge and it's made of mostly maize flour, which is mixed with water and left to cook for some time to make ugali. Yeah, so that is the simple definition of ugali, and it's actually a staple food, and especially in Kenya, but also in the Great Lakes region of Africa. So a lot of people actually consume ugali, and in Kenya it accounts for about a third of all calories consumed. And according to the National Bureau of Statistics, the per capita consumption of ugali is about 63.3 kgs of all food that is consumed per annum. So that's quite a significant number, and that is why I felt the need to make this video. So the consumption of ugali is actually divided into according to the type of flour that is used. That is the wholemeal or posho meal flour, or unga ya kisiagi as you might call it, and refined corn flour, which is what we buy in the supermarket. In posho meal flour, the bran and the jam are included in the flour and have not been removed. But in refined corn flour, you find that they remove the bran and the jam to make the flour whiter, so that it can also cook faster, and also it can be smoother. That's why the wholemeal flour or the wholemeal ugali advocates recognize that it's healthier because it has more fiber and micronutrients which are present in the jam and the bran, which lacks in the refined corn flour. So the downside of using posho meal flour is that it takes quite a bit of time to cook because the starch is still intact, and so it has to cook for about 30 minutes before it's ready, unlike the refined corn flour, which takes about 10 to 15 minutes. The wholemeal flour is also a bit yellowish, so the color is not as appealing as the refined corn flour, which is whiter, and also the texture is a bit coarse. So overall, the sensory characteristics of refined corn flour are a bit on a more preferred side than that of the wholemeal ugali. So those are the differences. But the sensory appeal of the refined corn flour actually comes at the cost of the nutritional value, because refined corn flour has less fiber, and because the jam has been removed, it is low in the micronutrients, that is minerals such as zinc, and also the B vitamins, especially vitamin B3, which is usually concentrated in the jam. So when you remove the jam, you find that most of those nutrients are not in the final product. It's also worth noting that some of the posho meals have upgraded equipment to remove the bran, making white flour. You know, the flour that is passed to remove the chaff before it's milled. So you find that the flour is a bit whiter and has a bit of low fiber. For some of us who are using posho meals, you've seen some of those machines. When most of the jam and bran has been removed, you find that the ugali or flour, as we have discussed, is low in micronutrients, and the government actually mandated most of these processors to fortify the flour to ensure that it meets most of the requirements for micronutrients. This is because ugali accounts for about a third of all calories consumed. So according to a National Research Fund study in Kenya, only 2% of the 177 samples that were collected complied with all the regulatory requirements for 3 micronutrients that are required by the government. That is iron, zinc, and vitamin A. From this study, we can see that the fortification laws are hardly ever met because 2% compliance is quite low. So tunafail hapo kwa fortification because it's not doing anything, and considering that about 75% of the urban population actually consume these refined flours, so that is about 75% of the population in the urban areas which is compromised, and they are not getting the nutrition that is required from these flours unless they get it from somewhere else. And it has a lot to do with inadequate infrastructure in the regulatory bodies because funding is also an issue. But point is, fortification is not being done as it should be done, and it could lead to a lot of issues, especially the hidden hunger issue, which is consumption of enough macronutrients but failing to consume micronutrients which are actually needed in the bodily functions, hence deficiencies. So there is a lot that the government needs to do, especially with regards to fortification, to ensure that it's at least being properly done. So now let us discuss the issue of aflatoxins contamination, whereby one study shows that the portion meal flour is significantly more contaminated, or the likelihood of portion meal flour being contaminated with aflatoxins is significantly more than that of refined corn flour. The study shows that in the informal or portion meal market, the mean aflatoxin concentration was 9.9 parts per billion, which is very close to the national limit of 10 parts per billion. In comparison, the mean contamination level for the packaged flour in the formal sector was 4.9 parts per billion. So numbers from this study also paint a very concerning picture, in that 25% of the samples that were taken from the portion meal exceeded the maximum acceptable limits for aflatoxin levels according to KEBS. So that is 1 in 4 samples that were taken from the portion meal market. In contrast, only 10% of branded samples exceeded the 10 parts per billion limit. And it's actually interesting that only 2% of the samples that were taken from the national brands, that is the nationally sold brands, exceeded the aflatoxin limit. So we move from 2% of the national brands failing to 10% of the branded brands, that is national and regional brands failing, to 25% of the portion meal brands failing. Yeah, so it's something to think about. And to be realistic, aflatoxins tend to concentrate on the outer layer of the maize. So when the bran is removed, some of that aflatoxin is also removed. So that actually explains why the refined maize flour has much lower levels of aflatoxins. The issue of aflatoxin contamination is actually very serious because you remember the 2004 and 2005 outbreak, which led to a mortality rate of almost 40%. It was actually 39.4%, not forgetting the chronic exposure which leads to liver cancer. And if you've been chronically exposed to aflatoxin contamination and at the same time you've been exposed to hepatitis B, your chances of getting liver cancer increase by 30 times. So you are 30 times more likely to get liver cancer than people who have neither been exposed to aflatoxins or hepatitis B. So it's actually a very big issue, and not only cancer but also stunted growth, because according to studies, chronic exposure also leads to stunted growth in children, which is an issue that is affecting 18% of Kenyan children. And in regions that are notorious for aflatoxins contamination or chronic aflatoxin exposure, such as Makueni County, the issue of stunted growth spikes to 28.7%. That's a huge number, and it's actually not attributed totally to aflatoxins exposure, but we cannot discount that fact because you find that regions such as Makueni and Machakos also suffer from malnutrition. So that could be contributing, but we cannot discount the fact that these children are also chronically exposed to aflatoxins, which has been proven to cause stunted growth in children. In one study, exposure rates to aflatoxins through flour in children younger than 5 years, that is in Makueni County, were 44 times more than the exposure rates in Nandi County. I'm actually tempted to urge the government to do something about it, but this is the government that just last year in October 2024 allowed about 2 million kilograms of rice from Pakistan that was contaminated with aflatoxins to enter the Kenyan market. And they really didn't do anything until an alarm was raised, and they only managed to recall about 23,000 kilograms. So from 2 million to 23,000, that is about, I'm just doing the math. So our government only recovered 1% of contaminated rice. The rest we consumed, and it's the same government that is supposed to regulate the local market. Yeah, we are in serious trouble, and that is on top of the 2011 case whereby maize that was contaminated with aflatoxins was released into the Kenyan market, and it actually came from the US. And the KEBS people, or the director of KEBS, says that they were never allowed to test that product. So I wonder how a product or maize that is contaminated with aflatoxins was allowed to get into the country without being tested by KEBS. So the aflatoxin problem is something to think about, and it affects us more than we think, because especially the issue of stunted growth does not really affect the physical body only, but also the cognitive function of the children who consume or who are chronically exposed to. So it's quite a lot to think about, and it's also something that we need to consider when making these purchases. But as I said earlier in my video, aflatoxins are usually concentrated on the outer part of the seed, and that can also be removed at the portion mill using the dehulling method. I think the portion mill has a name, and it actually removed even the pedicel. And when you are using flour that is processed using the portion mill that has a dehuller, even the cooking time is reduced. The flour is whiter, it doesn't have the pedicel, and I think some of the bran is also removed, and you have the micronutrients which are usually removed in the refined corn flour. Let's not forget that the flour has a significantly lower shelf life, especially when it's not stored in a dark, airtight container. And our conventional methods of storing flour leave it exposed to a lot of the elements, and the flour becomes rancid. So make sure that when you're using that flour, you utilize it within 2 to 3 weeks, and also ensure that it is stored in a dark, airtight container to preserve it and extend its shelf life. So we've discussed the nutritional value of wholemeal versus refined corn flour. We've discussed fortification and why it's a lie actually, and we have also discussed the issue of aflatoxins. And let me just remind you before we move on to the next part that because the germ and bran are intact in the wholemeal flour, the glycemic index is much lower than that of refined corn flour, and that is a glycemic index of 62 versus as much as 109 in refined corn flour. And glycemic index is, to put it simply, the speed at which a food spikes up your blood sugar levels when consumed. So a glycemic index of above 70 means that the food will very quickly spike up your blood sugar levels, and below 70 is moderate or low. So you find that Glucose has a glycemic index of 100, and if refined maize flour has a glycemic index of about 109, it means that it spikes up the blood sugar levels at a higher rate than pure glucose. So you can see how that could contribute to some of the non-communicable diseases that are caused by high intake of sugar, such as diabetes. So advocates of wholemeal flour or wholemeal ugali are actually right when telling you to consume wholemeal flour or wholemeal ugali. So yeah, that is it about glycemic index. And don't forget that there are foods which have a much lower glycemic index, such as millet flour or millet ugali, which has a glycemic index of about 46, which is quite low, and it's a much better option when you are considering which food to take, especially if you are pre-diabetic or diabetic. So, but consult that with your doctor, because I'm not a medical expert, but it's information that is out there. And just remember that glycemic index is not really an accurate method to use when determining these things, because there is also something that is called a glycemic load, and it actually takes into consideration the portions that you consume, because you may find that ugali may or wholemeal ugali has a glycemic index of 62, but you know our Kenyan behaviors whereby the recommended portion is actually a fist size. So you're supposed to eat ugali which is this big, but if you tell someone to consume ugali that is this big, they may wonder why you are giving them advice. Hmm? To most people, especially the people who do hard manual labor, they may not understand why they have to take such a small portion of ugali. But let's remember that it has a lot to do with balanced diet, because if you take this much of ugali with meat and a lot of vegetables, because vegetables are supposed to account for about 50% of your plate, but that is not the reality in most of the Kenyan households, whereby getting vegetables is a bit challenging, and ugali constitutes majority of the plate. So you find that ugali is 50% of the plate, and maybe a quarter of that is vegetables, and the rest is a legume or meat. So there is also the issue of poverty, but I think most of these decisions should be made in an educated way, in an informed way, because if someone, no matter how poor they are, knows this information, they may make more effort to ensure that they are getting a balanced diet. So there is an issue of what you pair the ugali with, because if you pair the ugali with, say, mala or fermented milk, it actually raises the glycemic index. So you find that you may not get the full effect of consuming a lower glycemic index food if you are using wholemeal, if you are pairing it with mala. But also you remember there is the issue of portion size. So if you control your portions, you may actually be able to eat ugali with mala or fermented foods. So we've said that 50% of your plate is supposed to have vegetables, but let me just say that there is the issue of anti-nutrients, which are chemicals or substances which reduce the bioavailability of some of the nutrients that are available in ugali or in the meal in general. So you find that anti-nutrients such as phytic acid is present in maize, but some of it is removed during processing into refined flour. But wholemeal flour has all the phytic acid, unless it's fermented, which I highly doubt, because almost nobody ferments ugali. So you find that there is phytic acid, and if you pair the ugali with foods which are also high in phytic acid or other micronutrients such as oxalates, vegetables such as the African nightshade or managu, we have the spider flower or saga, and amaranth, that is, I think it's terere, they have some sort of an anti-nutrient. So that is why boiling those vegetables and pouring out the fast water before you continue cooking usually reduces some of the anti-nutrients. So moving on to the next portion of this video, which is mitigation of some of these issues raised, starting with portion meal ugali. The two issues that we discussed is the number one, the physical parameter. That is, if you have an issue with the cooking time, the color or texture, and even the taste. And this is actually my personal opinion because I also have the same issues with the wholemeal flour. You can just take it to the portion meal, but ensure that they pass it through the dehulling machine to remove the pedicel and some of that bran to correct the texture and to shorten the cooking time, while keeping most of the micronutrients which are usually in the jam, and the dehuller does not remove the jam. So you will find that you will keep some of the micronutrients while reducing the cooking time and also improving the texture of the food. So this process will also correct the issue of aflatoxins. In case your maize has aflatoxins, the dehuller will remove the outer layer and the pedicel where most of the aflatoxins is, and that will help you with the issue of aflatoxins, because it would be unreasonable for me to tell you to take all your samples to the lab for analysis, and I know most of the aflatoxins tests are actually very expensive, at around, I think the last time I checked, one test costs around 3,000 shillings. So the best idea is to, if you are one of those people who buys maize, ensure that you are dehulling. And another tip is to buy only new maize. So don't buy maize that has stayed in the market for around 6 months. So the fresher the maize, the lower the chance that the maize is contaminated with aflatoxins. And something else also, it depends on where you source the maize, because research has shown that maybe maize that is sourced from Nandi, most of the maize is very low in aflatoxins, and it's a good idea to ensure that you are sourcing that maize from areas, especially areas which are dry and not too humid when during the harvest season. I think most of the areas that are affected are especially in the Ukambani region, and parts of Kwale are affected by the issue of aflatoxins contamination during harvest. And if you are a farmer, there is a product called Alpha Safe which is used after planting, and it has like harmless strains of Aspergillus flavus, which is a microorganism that produces aflatoxins. So these harmless strains of Aspergillus, they kind of monopolize the field and prevent the harmful Aspergillus from growing and contaminating your maize with aflatoxins. Yeah, so it's actually a good product, and I will link some of the research down below so that you have all the information that you need. 1 kg is around 200 shillings, and you need about 4 kg per acre. So I think it's a good initiative, and it will not only prevent your family from consuming product that is high in aflatoxins, it will also help your clients or customers that you supply to ensure that they are not being affected by your product. So if you are the kind of person who consumes refined maize, especially the people who are living in the urban areas, because according to research, 83% of us who live in urban areas consume refined flour. The best option is to ensure that you are balancing your diet and including enough fiber into your diet or your meals, because you are actually supposed to consume about 450 grams of fruits and vegetables, but most of us don't do that, which we should. And maybe try and mix your corn flour with other flours, such as millet. It's a very good option, and I have seen a lot of studies out there of maybe corn flour being mixed with omena or moringa, which is a very good option. I've seen some of the research of mixing ugali with chia seeds, but I really don't think that is sustainable, because there is a phenomena or a research. It's not really a research, but it's kind of a biological predisposition called sensory specific satiety, whereby if you consume food that has a specific taste or smell, your body will start rejecting it after some time. So you see, ugali is very bland. It doesn't really have any distinct flavor that may overwhelm the taste buds. So if you start mixing it with moringa or omena or chia seeds, which have a very specific overwhelming taste, your mind or taste buds will start rejecting the ugali after some time, which is not what we are trying to achieve here. So maybe mix with millet flour. I know some variants of millets don't have an overwhelming taste, especially the reddish or yellowish millet. It's a bit mild, and you can mix that with your refined flour. And I think and I actually like millet because it's not really going to interfere with your sensory specific satiety. Maybe if you really like wholemeal and you'd like to have some sort of an assurance of quality, I think there are some very good brands out there where you can get your flour, and they are also tested for aflatoxins. I think one of them is Nutrigo. I think I'd recommend them. I've used their flour and I really don't have any complaints. So yeah, I think that's it for this video, and I really hope you gained something from this video, and just comment down below if you have any questions. So also answer down below if the issue of aflatoxins was dealt with. Will you still go for wholemeal flour or refined flour? Bye until the next video.